Welcome everyone to our Mark video series during this Lenten season. My name is Lindsay Runyon, Associate Pastor here at A&M United Methodist Church, and with me is the Dr. Jack Bodden. I know. He is a retired psychologist in both the clinical and academic setting. He has taught at A&M, he has worked at Baylor Scott and White, he's also taught at Texas Tech, and unfortunately the Ohio State. I know. That's why I'm wearing my Michigan yellow and blue right now too. I know, you have the shirt on and everything. But we are so excited that he is here with us. He's also a certified spiritual director. He does a lot of our Wednesday Bible study. He leads those at our church and works in prison ministry and also animal shelters as well. So he has a lot of great stories. And so we are very excited that he could be here with us and dive in to Mark 1 through 3, our very first session here. So we have to set the bar pretty high for everyone else. I just want to ask the question, what do you think makes the Gospel of Mark? You have any thoughts?
Well, from what I remember, it's supposed to be the oldest of the synoptic Gospels, and Mark doesn't have the Christmas story, it doesn't the Nativity story. It really doesn't go into any details about Jesus' temptation in the wilderness. There's a real sense of urgency as you read Mark. He's kind of like he's really feeling oppressed to get the story out.
Yeah.
And so he only kind of puts the essential details.
Yeah.
So it's probably the most unique of the four Gospels. It doesn't have as much overlap as Mark or as Luke and Matthew do.
Yeah.
So.
No, yeah, I agree. Because it starts off right with the proclamation of John the Baptist, and then heads in with the baptism of Jesus, and then we get the call of the disciples, which I kind of wanted to focus in on. So that theme of call to disciples, it says, chapter 1, verse 16, as Jesus passed along the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and his brother Andrew casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And then it goes on to say, Jesus said, "Follow me, and I will make you fish for people." What are your kind of thoughts on discipleship and following and fishing, maybe?
Yeah. Well, we have to remember they fished with the nets rather than rod and reel. But my feeling was you can't take that metaphor too literally. But I think if you think about it as them casting the nets widely and bringing in all kinds of fish sort of says to me that it means that we want to be very inclusive in the ministry and that we bring in all sorts of people, and it's about bringing in a community rather than a select a group of people.
Yeah.
So in that way, I really like that metaphor. And there must have been something very powerful about Jesus' presence, because when he goes up to Peter and he goes up to the disciples, he just says, "Follow me," and they throw down their livelihoods and follow him. So there must have been something very compelling about his presentation. I've always kind of wondered what it was.
Yeah.
He didn't have to plead with him.
Exactly.
Or offer him anything. He just said, "Come with me,"
And they did.
And they did.
Yeah, and I wonder if they actually knew kind of the cost of following him yet, or if that was thinking. If you think about kind of social media today and kind of Instagram or TikTok or even kind of Facebook, you just click follow,
right,
and that's all you need to do.
Yeah.
But we know definitely the call of discipleship, there's a lot of sacrifice within that too.
I don't see how they could have, really. These were pretty simple, somewhat maybe even illiterate individuals. I don't see how they could have really known what they were signing up for.
Exactly. That's how they stuck with it, for sure. Then right after the call to discipleship, we get one of Jesus' first teaching. And the Gospel of Mark is really unique because it talks a lot about authority and the authority of Jesus. It says, chapter 1, verse 22, they were astounded at his teaching, for he had taught them as one having authority and not as one of the scribes. And then it goes on and talks about this man with an unclean spirit. And this clean spirit was actually the first one to describe Jesus as who he is. It says, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God."
Yeah.
And then obviously Jesus casts out that unclean spirit. But what are your thoughts on kind of that authority of Jesus
There's a lot contained in that very short passage.
Right, it's so
You know,
dense.
like, to me, the authority, I mean, when you think about authority, it means there's some power that's handed down from a higher source.
Yeah.
And certainly that would have been Jesus and God. And when he spoke, it wasn't like the Pharisees, who probably just referred back to the Torah and told people what the law was. With Jesus, there was a sense of personal ownership almost, and then of course his healings really demonstrated a power that he had that certainly the Pharisees would not have had. So the people must have been really pretty astounded by that, and the fact that it was a personal kind of statement rather than a reference back to the Torah or something that Moses said. And then, that healing, I mean, it was a deliberate, almost provocative kind of statement that he knew was going to get the Pharisees pretty upset. But I think, as one writer put it, he elevated love above the law. And I think so much of what we see him doing is not casting aside the law, but really looking at what's behind the law. What was the intent or the content of the law? Where the Pharisees, it was all about, do you follow the letter of the law?
Yeah, that's good.
And with Jesus, it was more of the spirit, or what was actually behind the law that Jesus was trying to get across.
And I think we can see that all throughout Jesus' ministry, and what made it so almost radical, that it wasn't about just like you said, the black and white of the law, but the spirit behind it, whether it was healing on the Sabbath or going to these unclean lepers and healing them as well. It was about love and relationship.
And the fact that the demon that possessed the man could see him, to me, it was always a very interesting statement. And it actually is a little research that says mildly depressed people may actually have a more realistic view of life than non-depressed people. And so, we tend to see what we want to see or expect to see, and it may have been the demons just saw very clearly who this was. They didn't have a particular expectation, so I thought it was very interesting that they were the first to really see him so clearly. And wondered about what was he going to do. No,
that makes sense. Especially when, like you said, the expectation of what we want to see, it's so easy to see in that sort of lens of, oh no, he's just another guy, or he's the Messiah. But the awe and trembling that these unclean spirits had, of kind of knowing who he is, of Jesus of Nazareth, the Son of Man, the Son of God.
Well, and too, you think about the casting out part. A lot of what the biblical notion of sin is in many ways very similar to what we think of as addictions now. And if you think about what Jesus did every time he cast out the demons, the person would writhe on the ground and froth at the mouth. And it's very similar to an unmedicated kind of withdrawal. If you think about someone who's addicted to alcohol and they go through withdrawal, if it's not a medicated withdrawal, they're going to go through almost exactly the same kind of symptoms that we see the people going through here as the demons were cast out. So I think that's a really interesting passage.
And even if you think about even the unclean spirits, in this passage or throughout the Gospel of Mark, they're always by themselves, or always kind of isolating themselves, kind of like addiction does sometimes, or something to hide or not kind of talk about or anything like that.
Right, exactly. That's really what most psychological disorders and certainly addiction does. Is it does tend to isolate us, and so we don't know what happened to the demons after they're cast out, except that one case where they went into the pig and went off the cliff. But
it's definitely interesting. And not all sin has to be addiction either. It's just kind of this example or a lens that we can look at as well, because there's definitely other perspective and other scholars who think differently. But I love your kind of psychological, clinical perspective on what kind of this looks like as addiction.
I've always thought that, when it talks about demon possession, I've always kind of thought about that as probably the way primitive cultures understood mental illness, because they had no other way to explain it, and as Jesus would address that problem, he always talked in terms that the culture of his day could understand. So whether it actually was a demon or whether that was just the way that culture understood mental illness, I've always sort of looked at it as probably some kind of mental illness.
Yeah. It's fascinating. Yeah, I wonder if we could create like a New Testament, or maybe the modern New Testament, to figuring out how this could all look, or the language that we could use today and stuff.
Right.
That's good. It's interesting. And what about this kind of disciples and the authority that Jesus has? How do you think the disciples were thinking at this time? If they had just followed Jesus and they saw this man in the unclean spirit, or kind of the next ones talk about more healings and everything like that. What do you think the disciples were thinking?
Well, it must have been just really totally amazing to them.
Yeah.
And, I think in a lot of ways he was preparing his disciples to do the same kind of thing in their time.
Yeah.
And so I think he was really modeling and demonstrating it, but it must have been pretty amazing to them to see that.
For sure.
To see these people who had been ill or crippled for many, many years in some cases.
Yeah.
And for him to just make them whole,
Right.
make them clean. It just really must have been a mind-blowing experience for him. And when he sent the disciples out on their own, I think they must have felt a certain trepidation. Can we really do that? I mean, did they have that kind of trust?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that was an illustration of how he just expected them to trust.
Yeah.
That if they had that faith, that power would be there.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's almost like everything that Jesus did was an object lesson with some sort of teaching.
It really was.
Let me show you this, and then let me explain it to you.
Yeah.
Kind of like when your grandmother says, don't touch the stove, but you do it anyway, and then you get the lesson afterwards on...
Yeah. And when he sent them out on their own, and then they kind of came back, they talked, and like we were amazed. We could do some of the same things.
No, that's good. That's awesome. Well, do you have any final thoughts on Mark 1-3, or any good stories that come up in your kind of past ministries or classrooms at all?
Well, I think he was just really saying that sometimes so much of what he calls us to do is based on faith and trust.
Mm.
And to understand that power doesn't necessarily come through us, that we're a channel, we're a vehicle for that. And I think that's so true even today. I mean, I think when we think about God's grace, how else is it manifest except through people, except through relationships? So I think when we talk about the hands and feet of Christ, to me that says we're the conduits. I mean, that's how God's love is going to be seen in this world, is through our relationships. Yeah. And sometimes the little things that we do for people can make a really big difference. And I think that story we see over and over again, that sometimes it's the little things, the small number of fishes and loaves that, it's not, we don't always have to have the ample supply, but with faith and trust, the little things that we can do can make a big difference.
That's good. That's good. And there's a specific prayer that you like.
Oh, yeah.
I have the prayer, but do you want to explain what the Merton prayer is?
Well, Thomas Merton has this prayer that to me captures a lot of this doubt and this uncertainty about our own ability and our own capacity. But in that prayer, there's that sense of trusting in God and trusting that the things that we do, even though we don't have the answers or the full understanding, we trust that wanting to please God is really important and makes a difference. So I've always loved that prayer. If I could have written it, I would have written a prayer like that.
That's awesome. Well, we are definitely going to send that prayer to you all. It's an incredible Merton prayer. It'll be in your curriculum as well. And just, I think what I've learned from the day, faith and trust in the small things. God is with us always, whether we know it or not, and it's seeking Him and casting our net out wide to love all people. And so I'm excited. I think we set the bar pretty high for session 1. So we'll see what the next few weeks have for the Gospel of Mark. And we're so excited that you could join us today, and we hope that you can continue to dive deeper in this series and in these few chapters as we continue just to follow Jesus with wherever we are and knowing that He is always with us.